Welcome back to the afternoon, to the last session of today. I'll be doing a very quick introduction here. So for the last session, we have Baird with us from Philips. Pat is the head of global software standards at Philips, which is really cool. And his background is a master in science in healthcare quality and patient safety. And what I think is really interesting to note is that he's also a representative from the industry in the AIMD, so the Artificial Intelligence Medical Device Working Group with IMDRF. So I hope that he can give us also a little bit of insight in what's coming and what we can expect as AI manufacturers of software medical devices in the future. So Pat, I'd like to give it over to you, and thanks for being here.
All right, thank you very much. As Leanne mentioned, my life pretty much has been artificial intelligence in the last few years, working on the standards, trying to take and educate and also help understand what the regulators are looking for. This is very much a work in progress, so please don't expect that secretly hidden away there's some regulations you just haven't found yet related to this. The regulators themselves are still struggling with this. But I thought it would be good to just have an overall view of what's going on in this landscape, so you can see where things are going and where things aren't going. So with that, I'm going to take and share my screen. And then start my slide deck. All right, well, as I mentioned, this is a sort of a status update on, what's going on with the standards and regulations. But, before we jump into that, I did want to give a little bit of background about AI. I've noticed in different conversations, there's some things that sometimes get confused. And there's a couple themes that I noticed on several of the different committees that I'm on. So wanted to give you a bit of an introduction before jumping into regulatory. First of all, there are so many different definitions of artificial intelligence. You can spend a lot of time taking and arguing about it. I refuse to argue about the definition anymore. I've spent enough of my life on that. But I really like this. This is from American Medical Association. So a set of doctors got together to describe this. And I kind of like their idea of, instead of calling it artificial intelligence, right in the middle of the paragraph, they mention augmented intelligence. And the idea is that, AI is here to help people, not to replace people. We aren't at that replace point yet. So let's not be afraid of it. Let's see how we can take and use this to help us give better healthcare. I notice that in any discussion that I have about AI in healthcare, within the first 20 minutes, someone must mention the diabetic retinopathy and IDXDR. So I always put in a couple slides just using this as an example. For folks that aren't familiar, there's the possibility when you have high blood sugar levels, it can hurt your eyes. And this IDXDR product takes retinal images, upload them to a cloud server, does some analysis on it, and comes back and saying either more than mild diabetic retinopathy, go see a human, or negative, it's not more than mild, come back in a year. It provides a screening decision without having the clinician to interpret the results. And so there's a lot more people that can get screened because you don't have to always, every time, go to a specialist. This can take that place. The benefit is, more people access to it because there's more people that can be screened this way, and earlier detection of it is going to help in, having those interventions. The risks, taking the image of the eye doesn't result in any direct harm to the patient. There's possibly some false negatives, but the fact is this disease moves pretty slow. So that's why it says come back in a year. And if there's a false positive, it says, ooh, you might have something. Well, you know what? The human specialist is going to make that final decision. So overall, the benefits outweigh the device risks. Now, one of the questions that I get sometimes from people is, why are we talking about this artificial intelligence stuff now? I've heard about it back in the 90s. I heard about it back in the 80s. Why is this going to be different? And I personally remember working on genetic algorithms on my Commodore 64 computer, if people can remember that far back, in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And Well, my response to them is that there's some changes between what we had back in the 1980s and 90s and what's going on now. One of the main driving factors is the Internet of Things and big data, and we just have a ton of data that we can take and analyze now. The other thing, when I was looking into this, that I thought was interesting was that, a lot of the techniques that people are using now are really neural nets, and there's a lot of multiplication, a lot of computations you have to do to run a neural net. And that was more difficult back in the 1980s. But with the explosion of video games and people buying video game units, the processors in video games, the graphic processing units, they do lots of multiplications. They do lots of calculations in parallel. And because they're in these video games sold, in the millions, that drops the price of the GPUs. So because consumers are buying video games, that dropped the price for people to have the servers to take and do some of this. I just love that story. Um, Another question that I get often, or really a point of confusion, is people will say machine learning, or when they actually mean artificial intelligence, or they'll say artificial intelligence when they really mean something else. There's lots of different fields here. I'm not going to explain this diagram. I just really liked it, though, showing where different worlds collide, and there's a little subset inside of other sets. And I like pointing out that it's an intersection of a lot of different stakeholders. The data science people, it might be the same, might be different than some of the machine learning people, et cetera. Um, One thing also when I'm talking to people is they think that we have to scrap the way that we do things. No, the old processes don't work anymore. This is a completely new technology. We need something completely new and different. We can't use the old way of doing things. So I propose to them that data handling is very important. So what if for good data handling practices, we keep records and say where did we get this sample from? You need to document and make sure you do it in a safe manner of doing that sourcing, any processing you need to do of the sample, preservation of the sample, testing, and any other handling you need to do. And people usually agree. Want to protect against contamination and viruses? Well, yeah, that makes sense. Then I point out to them that the process that I just talked about was from an IMDRF document about taking tissue samples. It wasn't about getting data at all. And my point is, we already know how to do good supplier controls. We already know what good looks like in many ways. Let's just take that structure of how we know how to do things and what details do we need to put in specific to machine learning. We don't need to throw away everything. We can reuse what we already know. One thing I like to warn people about, and I've mentioned it a couple times, is sometimes the terminology can be very confusing. I've spent too much time in meetings arguing with people just to see that, oh, they had a different definition that I did. Want to make sure that you understand narrow AI versus general AI. Does the software know a lot about a little, narrow AI, or does it know a lot about a lot, general AI? Lock systems versus continuous learning system or adaptive systems. Does the system learn over time? Even if it does learn over time, is it learning after every single patient? Or is it waiting 6 months and then retraining itself, or waiting until it has another 1,000 data points and then retraining? I had mentioned before that there was that Venn diagram of the different fields interacting with each other, and they haven't had to talk to each other in the past. And so validation, when we're talking about medical devices, is about meeting user needs. But when I'm talking to some of the data scientists, validation is making sure the data is valid. The example I like to use is, if the data you have shows a negative heart rate, you probably shouldn't trust that data. Um, Bias is something that data scientists will try to eliminate. Bias is bad. But I've talked to lots of customers that actually want bias. They said, no, we don't want something that's trained across the entire population. I work in a retirement community in Florida. I want something that's just trained on my kinds of patients, not everyone else. I want it to be positively biased for me. And then supervised versus unsupervised. A lot of people think that that's, is there a human looking over the shoulder of the robot performing the surgery? Then it's supervised learning. Well, it has a much different meaning. Um, there are new risks. There are some new things that are a little different that we might not have thought about before. I really like this article from a couple years ago, California wildfires back in 2017. The LAPD had to tell drivers to stop using navigation apps, okay? Because the navigation app says, oh, you want to get out of the city. Why don't you take this road? Because over on that road, there's like no cars. It'll be faster then. Go that way. And of course, that's where it's on fire. So, but just the fact that the police department had to tell people, stop trusting the technology, I thought was interesting. Now, AI can fail in some other ways. This is something that Berkman from the FDA had shared a couple years ago, and I really like this example. So I got permission from him to take and use the slide. But there was some training going on. This is a real life example um, where trained with a bunch of images and said, "What do you software? What do you think this is?" Software says 87% confidence. This is a Persian cat. Someone then went back through and changed some pixels. This is the updated image, okay? I'm not seeing, as a human, I'm not seeing much that changed. But the software says, you know, this isn't a Siamese cat. This is a toaster. Yeah, this bakes bread with a 98% confidence. And so some of this stuff, it's going to be, I think, finding root cause analysis for some failures is going to be very interesting. So that might be a challenge that we need to take and focus on. Another thing, it had dawned on me, I had joined a standard group working on autonomous vehicles. Not that I know anything about autonomous vehicles, but I just wanted to see, you know, what is it they're thinking of? What is it that I can take and learn and apply those general concepts to medical devices? And so there was a section that said, um, as the car is approaching a stoplight and the stoplight goes from green to yellow, what should you do? You know, how do you decide whether to go ahead and go through the intersection or stop? And so I stopped reading and I'm like, okay, well, I should look to see how fast the vehicle is going. How far is it before I need to stop? And then, oh, the road conditions, you know, is it snowing? Is it icy? And fortunately, the people who were working on the standard were more self-aware than I, because when I checked back later in that standard, they said, no, the first thing you do is you check the rearview mirror, because there's been that jerk that's been tailgating you. And just because you can stop in time doesn't mean the jerk behind you can stop in time. So it might make more sense for you to go through the yellow light because that person can't stop. It's like, wow, you know, if I was the software developer or writing the requirements, I would have totally forgotten about that. I'm going to have to be more aware of things that are so deeply burned into us, we don't even think about them. They're second nature. Um, Other articles that I've seen is use of facial recognition software just to try to catch people that are crossing the street as pedestrians when they shouldn't be. And one failure that I saw was that a local business owner had an advertisement on the side of a bus, and the advertisement had that person's face on it. And so every time the bus drove by the camera said, "Hey, there's this person. We know who it is that keeps crossing the street when other cars are there. That's dangerous." Another time, there was some protests, and to defeat facial recognition software, people painted their face, you know, in different colors, and then wore a shirt that had someone else's face on it. And so the software, you know, looked on top of the person's body, didn't see a face, but oh, and the shirt noticed that, yep, there's eyes, there's a nose, there's some ears. No one bothered telling the software that, you know, usually the person's face is on top of their body, not in the middle of the body. They were so focused on, you know, finding those details. Again, they forgot the second nature. And then this final one, and you see the link to the Tesla, is someone took and modified a speed limit sign, just added some black tape to a speed limit of 35, and the Tesla read that as 85. And so I thought, oh, okay, I can understand how that can occur. But I also know that as a human, from where I normally drive, there isn't a sign called 85 miles an hour. So even if I did interpret it as 85, I would question it. And then that made me think, you know, I live near Chicago. There's lots of snow in the winter. People will ride their snowmobiles. And in the winter, they'll set up tiny little stop signs at the side of the road telling the snowmobiler stop, because cars might be crossing here. And I worry that, a self-driving vehicle, does it know that there's going to be these tiny little stop signs in the snow? They're only 2 feet off the ground instead of, 2 meters. Did anyone think to tell the software engineer about that? So anyway, enough about those. I just find it fascinating, some of the mistakes that we're going to be making. Switching topics over to regulatory landscape. IMDRF, I know that most people are interested in. They did start a working group, in fact, September of last year, just to develop a glossary. Did have a very long discussion about should we talk about machine learning systems where machine learning is used anywhere inside of the product, or only where machine learning impacts benefit and risk? And I mention that because there are many business uses for software, things that might make things more efficient in running a hospital, and that might be a feature, part of the clinically that's included in clinically significant software. But just because the ML is in there somewhere, if it isn't included in the clinical practice part, doesn't hurt safety, does it need new regulations or not? So that was a long discussion. Currently, the glossary is being circulated inside of the management committee. It should go out in the next few weeks for public comment so folks can see it and provide feedback. One thing I did notice based on just some informal feedback that I'd gotten is people thought that this was a discussion about what the regulations should be for ML. And this is just a glossary. This is not a guidance at all about ML product development. That needs to be developed in the future, but folks believe that a glossary would be a good starting point. The US FDA had developed a proposed regulatory framework specifically around modifications. That was the interesting thing. I have a couple more slides about it. And one of the things that when I talk to people, what they bring up most of all is they know that there's a strong advantage with these learning systems, that as we get more data, we can retrain it and improve performance. And wow, it would be really nice if we were able to not have to go through the existing regulatory process every time we wanted to do an update. And so the FDA was very proactive in this and said, just an idea, what if during your initial pre-market submission, you told the FDA, what do you think you'll be changing in the future? So what they call software or SAMD pre-specifications, the SPS. What do you think you're going to be changing? And then also, how do you think you're going to change it? What's going to be that process? What's your algorithm change protocol? So, maybe you don't need a entirely new submission if you're just retraining with another 1,000 data points and you have a very controlled way that you're pushing it out to the customers. So they have a little bit of a flow chart. My approach in these slides is I'm not going to read everything to you. You can always go back and take a look at these later. But, you can still make changes that are outside of the SPS and ACP, and those will probably need a new submission. But if they're inside of the SPS and ACP, then document it and give it to your patients. We want to help people. Now, there is a industry project with some FDA participation, Medical Device Innovation Consortium, MDIC. They had worked with the FDA before on other initiatives the FDA had and wanted some input. And so they started a project to develop some white papers about the SPS and the ACP, and then a third paper that sort of explains the relationship between the two. It is written specifically for IVDs, but when we were working on it, we tried to not be specific about IVDs. The title is IVDs, but we think it can be applied to more things. We're wrapping that up in the next few weeks, and that should be out for a public comment. I expect by mid-October. FDA had an action plan earlier this year, just saying, beyond just SPS and ACP, there's other things that are going on. Again, I'm not going to read this to you. You can see it, but they want to update the proposed regulatory framework. They want to participate more with people outside of the FDA and work on consensus standards. They held a public workshop on trust back in 2020. They, in fact, have another one coming up in a couple of weeks that I'll be speaking at. They're doing some research with regulatory science efforts, talking to hospitals and some research institutes, and doing a lot of real-world pilots. Now, I expect that a lot of people watching this would be very interested in what's going on in the EU. And I think, as I alluded to before, things are very much in flux. There are some proposed things. People have argued that the proposals won't work. We don't need new regulations. We can just take and reuse some existing things. There's lots of discussion inside of the EU member states themselves trying to get consensus. So not just can the EU get to consensus, but a specific country, a specific state, do they agree with themselves internally on some of these things? So that's very much in flux. So I would not encourage people to read what's drafted and assume that's what will happen, because I expect there's going to be lots of changes related to that. South Korea was one of the first people that had published a guidance on this, and I thought that was very interesting. And they also happen to chair that IMDRF AI committee. China has some very detailed guidance documents and some very specific requirements. They have, for example, a draft standard just for annotation that's 41 pages long. Saudi Arabia also has some things. Other countries have some things. I wanted to highlight this one in Singapore. Because I have some concerns. They've developed a guidance for the software, but they want to ensure that there's absolutely no biases in the process. And I have a concern that I don't know if that can ever happen, because in my experience with healthcare, the healthcare system itself has biases, against certain patient populations. And so I'm not sure that they'd be able to take and reach this goal of perfection. And if they're waiting for perfection, does that mean their patients, their citizens, don't get the best care possible because it's not perfect? Going to go sideways a little bit for a proposal that I'll be making to IMDRF sometime in the future. And this goes back to the let's learn from other industries. Let's see what's already done out there and see how we can take and modify it and fit it in with our way of doing things. So one question that comes up a lot is, how much freedom do we give the software? How much oversight does it have? How much autonomy does it have? And so I did lots of research, dug up a lot of papers, read what different industries are doing, found this paper all the way back in 1978 that was actually about undersea robots and humans driving the undersea robot, the submarine. And when is it that the submarine should take over from the human driving, and when should the human take over from the submarine driving? I thought, okay, this is interesting. Read a couple other things. There's some automotive things that I had alluded to before. There was finally, I kind of like this. I had found this in actually a book about autonomous weaponry. And it talked about, it's just how much is the human involved in the process? How much is the human in the loop? One proposal, one classification they had, one section was the software does something and it's going to stop, and the human has to approve before the software does anything else. Another level is software is going to do something, but the human can stop it. I remember back in my college days working in a factory, and we would watch the machines, make the things that they needed to make. But if I see something going wrong, there was always a button that I could use to stop the manufacturing line. So the machines are competent for many things, but if there's something bad, I can stop them. And then a third level is, too bad, human, you're not in the loop. The machine's going to do what it thinks it's going to do. The end. There is no intervention. And so I thought, what if I took that IMDRF SAMD risk framework that talks about, is the software informing clinical management, driving in for management, treat or diagnose, and is the patient critical, serious, or non-serious? What if I put those different loops in? And so what if still do inform, still do drive, but treat and diagnose that's going to pause and wait for the human to approve it is going to be of a lower risk than treat or diagnose where the human can interrupt it, which is lower risk, then there is no intervention possible. So I'd really like us to see, again, let's learn from other industries, but then apply it to what we already know. Don't completely get rid of it and, go back to the 10 different levels. If we can just tweak a couple things that we already know how to do. Now I'm going to switch over to some of the things going on standards. This is just a overview slide saying I'll go into detail with them in the next couple slides, but there's a project in SC42 developing some horizontal standards for all industries, many simultaneous projects. I don't think that any of those standards are going to be required for medical devices, but they have ideas, that we would like and would like to carry to healthcare. For example, they have working on a standard about bias management, and for healthcare, we're going to have different controls in place for bias. But they have a list of different types of bias, some of which I hadn't thought of before, and it would be useful to use that as a foundation to start our medical device bias standard. TC215, people might know that because they do the 62304 standard, 82304 standard, the 80001 series, and over 200 other software standards. There was a group that had some recommendations, and a task force was proposed to just support when 62304 wants to do some AI stuff. This task force can say, okay, well, here's what the current standards are. Here's some use cases for you to take and consider. We're not going to rewrite 62304 for you, but we're going to provide from infrastructure and monitor what's going on in the rest of the world, so to make your job a little easier. IEEE is developing some standards as well. CTA, and I have a slide on this a little later, general AI standards in healthcare specific, and the folks at AAMI and the British Standards Institute have started an AI standards committee. Take a little sidestep because a lot of this is still evolving, and so standards are great when you know what the best practices are, but we're not sure what the best practices are quite yet. So wanted to talk about something that I call pre-standards. And so I found out about this by accident. The World Health Organization started a focus group for AI. And the idea is that, there's some countries that don't have really strong regulators. So can they set up this sort of third-party review by the WHO of products, and the WHO can take and evaluate them, almost act as a regulator for some of those countries. It's funny because this group was started because there was a conference about AI for good, just in general. What is it that AI can take and help people on? And after that meeting, people said, the healthcare people said, ooh, we want to do something specific. Let's go to the World Health Organization and ITU, International Telecommunications Union, and have them start doing something. So I thought it was very interesting that it wasn't the WHO that said, hey, we need this. It was people attending a conference saying, hey, we need this. So it's structured that they have, some expert clinical panels working on a benchmarking platform, coming up with data solution and quality assessment committee. Talk about it in another slide. Another group talking about regulatory, another group talking about data handling, several different projects, about a dozen or so different teams have signed up saying, hey, we have a product, can you please evaluate us? Now I talked about that, assessment committee. So we want to develop a quality assessment approach for the candidate AI applications. I sat down, since they made me the chair of it, and went through about 50 different existing standards and guidance documents and came up with a list of about 200 questions. And that was the starting point. Other people have added to it to develop sort of an audit, checklist of what are the things that we're looking for. We're just about to start the trial audits, seeing what these things are. I'm positive that we'll have some questions that end up just not making any sense, and we'll need to take and update it. So we're going to loop back and update, what those audit questions are based on feedback on whether or not they're useful. And what I really love about this is that, we're going to learn about our evaluation of learning systems. Yes, that's exactly what I think we need to do. My plan is, after we have that, then now that I know that these are good questions, we can reverse engineer that into writing standards and guidance documents. An example that just for one of the applications that I thought was very interesting, it's stuck in my brain a lot, is they have a project for snakebite identification. So snake bites result in 100,000 deaths, 400,000 disabilities, and usually disability is for the primary income generator for that family. So you have 500,000 families every year impacted by snake bites. Now, one of the problems is that different snakes have different types of venom, so you need different types of antivenom, and doctors aren't snake specialists, so they don't know what the difference is between the different kinds of snakes. So the idea is you could have a mobile app, you take a photo of the snake, it'll do snake recognition software, identify what kind of snake it is and what kind of antivenom. And then you just take and show that to the doctor. And one of the criticisms is, your target population might not necessarily have, a phone, and they've just been bit. Are they really going to take and remember to pull out the phone and get a photo of the snake? And completely understand that criticism, but we're talking 500,000 families every year. If we can help just a few, this is so worth it. So switching to another team, again, a general conference back in 2017, an AI summit. After the conference, people wanted to do something, they didn't know what. And so on a call afterwards, I said, well, why don't we start drafting some white papers on good machine learning practices? And so they did. First paper got published in 2017 of, what's different about AI. We took a look at 62304, the life cycle standard, and said, what extra things do we want to do? In 2019, published a trustworthiness paper, 2020 on data quality, and the current project is on bias management. And again, these are all volunteers. Nobody's getting paid for this. They're taking time out of their day to work on these white papers. They're not standards, but I'm really want to take and use these as the basis, as the starting point for standards. Writing an official standard takes forever. And having an initial draft to start with can really help us and help our patients. Another group called the Pistoia Alliance, 140 different members. And again, this was people met at a conference. There was some discussion about AI. They wanted to do something, so they got together and have started developing a best practices toolkit, and spun off a separate project just to take and do about this. And I have links for all of these at the end of the slides. Now, getting closer to writing standards, British Standards Institute and AAMI, standards group over here in the US, had written a couple white papers about AI and healthcare, and we wrote a white paper talking about AI and risk management. And the feedback we got from people is stop writing white papers, start writing standards. So we formed a committee, take a look at called 34971, taking a look at specific things about AI and machine learning for risk management. Folks might remember that there's 24971 that provides some extra guidance on how to implement the 14971 risk management standard. In that guidance, there's an annex of special considerations for IVDs. The idea is, you follow the same risk management process. You need to have a plan, you need to identify things, you need to evaluate things, put controls in place, make sure the controls work, etc. But here's some things that are a little different about IVDs that you might want to take and consider. Is one of the annexes there. And so for 34971, I thought this would be good to follow the same pattern, use the same process, but ML is going to fail in weird ways, in ways that people aren't thinking of. And so let's take and document some of those things and document possible risk controls for them. We'll have that report completed. It'll be a standard just for the US and the UK, but as soon as it's done, then I'm turning that over into a project proposal for ISO IEC for it to be, a broader global standard. Again, that theme of can I have a small team get something done quickly doesn't have to be perfect, but that will help accelerate the ultimate development of the standard. Consumer Technology Association, again, speaking of groups that move quickly, I know a lot of people might not have heard of them, particularly if you're deep into healthcare. What I like about CTA is their consumer electronics. They have a big trade show every year. And I tell people, if you look around your house, just about anything that you have electronics in it, that company is probably a member of CTA. So it gives a different viewpoint and gives a different access to some of the regulators for it. But that group also is really good at moving fast. And so we have some definitions, as well as the use of AI in healthcare trustworthiness, and a current project on data quality. This one is also pretty easy to take and join. Yeah. I had mentioned earlier that TC215, we have this ad hoc group that's going to provide some infrastructure support for other standards being developed. So it actually started as an ad hoc group to write a report. Once we write the report, then the group is done. The group no longer exists. You can take and download the report if you'd like, about 30 different recommendations, some of them very specific. And again, this was not a group that was told, go write standards. The group was said, what do we need if we do want to take and write standards? Similar to this presentation, what is it that the other standards groups are working on? What is it that we need to be aware of? How can we help accelerate 62304 writing a standard, or cybersecurity people writing a standard? This was just recently turned into, so we had recommendations of, we need this infrastructure. So the group voted and said, okay, group, now you're a task force, go do that infrastructure. So I'll be kicking that off in the next couple of weeks. There's a big group, ISO JTC1 SC42. These are AI standards for all industries. It is not specific to healthcare. The first meeting that I had with them, I sat between one person working on self-driving vehicles and another person, and this was interesting, it was a lawyer who wanted to write software that analyzes, when you go in front of this judge, what kind of legal arguments work better for this judge and what kind of legal arguments don't work for this judge. And so it was doing natural language processing analysis so as to how to influence judges for particular lawsuits. I understand that that might be a little creepy, but the point of that story is that this SC42 is a very wide variety of different stakeholders with lots of different views on the world. Many different working groups. And I think on my next slide, here's a partial inventory of some of the projects that they're working on. I did highlight two of them because there's a project on risk management, and I wanted to mention, at the top of the screen, they're talking about business risk management. They're talking about, is your project going to be done on time? Are you going to meet your sales quota? They're not talking about patient safety. There are some failure modes in there that we can take and certainly use for patient safety stuff. But really the focus there, I've had people say, why are you working on 34971? Just do whatever 23894 says. Well, 23894 isn't the same as 14971. A project that had started relatively recently about functional safety, you see on the bottom of the screen. So that's going to be more related to what we'll need for healthcare. But I remember one of the early meetings that I was at, the team was arguing, well, are we talking about keeping people safe from AI or keeping the AI safe from people? And that was a 40-minute discussion. IEEE, as I mentioned, had several standards, 2801, 2802, and 7003, I think would be of most interest to people. And then finally, as I wrap up, I had found this book. I mean this just completely as a joke. I found this book in a sale, so of course I need to take and buy this, How to Survive the Robot Uprising. And I thought I would read it as just to be funny, but what I actually found is it has really good advice. Things like, oh, when the robot insects are swarming and coming towards you, you can't grab a gun. Instead, grab a fire extinguisher, grab a can of spray paint. That's the way you stop, the swarm of robot insects. Again, it's silly, but I realized that some of the topics that I had today were kind of depressing, so I like to recommend this to people. And then finally, here's some links to those different alliances that I was talking about. With that, I'll stop and take any questions.
Thanks. It's very cool and nice presentation. Thanks a lot, Pat. It's given us a very good insight in what's coming towards us, I think, towards the future as AI manufacturers. And I'm slightly worried about all the developments that are ongoing. Not so much that there are developments ongoing, because obviously there are specifics with regards to AI that need to be taken into consideration. But if you look at the multitude of developments that are ongoing, and this is just, I think, from more of a global international perspective, but I can tell you that in the Netherlands, for example, right now, the Dutch ministry is developing their own guidelines on AI. I just recently saw this week that MHRA is intending to publish their own guidances related to medical devices and AI. And it goes on. And I guess it's also my question. Do you see that there's any room for harmonization in this field going forward in the future? Or do you feel it's going to become a bit of uncontrolled mess at some point?
This is why I'm trying to leverage the IMDRF work, is to take and point some of that out. One of the projects that I'm working on, just originally for my own sanity, but then I'm hoping to bring it to IMDRF, is to say, this is what China has for requirements. This is what Singapore has for requirements, and show them the similarities and the differences, and say, if you want me to deploy in your country, you need to understand that, you know, you're the only ones in the world that want this particular thing. I find it interesting because I see so many things. I see different nations have committees on, we're going to be number one in the world for AI. But also, here's some very heavy rules and regulations that's going to block us getting AI. So very interesting tension. But yes, I'm definitely trying to leverage IMDRF as much as possible.
Yeah, one of the questions that someone has asked as well is if there's any standards or groups working on guidelines to help specifically startups in the medical device field. And I guess what they mean is that with this multitude of all the documentation and all the standards and guidelines that are coming up, I assume that their question is more related, like, is there anything specific that helps us guide through all these mazes that are coming up? But I fear the answer.
I had started putting together one group, and the FDA had joined it as a collaborative community, just to, because all of the different teams are working on something. Hey, can we have a website, you know, for, oh, you want to learn about bias? Here's 5 different groups that are working on it. Here's some published white papers. Oh, you want to hear about data quality? Here's some references. So one place to go just for you to take and educate. And unfortunately, they lost funding. But I'm trying again a couple different avenues to try to get that back. What I've also noticed, and I'm trying to get funding or some volunteer with the time, is I noticed that the data scientists, a lot of these startups might come from the data science people that don't know the general regulations. You know, never mind the specific country, but just what's a quality management system? Why do I need to have a plan? Kinds of things. So I'd love to see, and again, trying to get some funding for basic introduction to quality management for data scientists, and then also introduction of data science to regulatory people, just because these are 2 different worlds and we need to understand each other's brains for this to work for our patients.
Yeah, I think it's also one of the things, right, that we see ongoing. And if you look at the standard development, is that most of the standards in SE42, I think it's difficult, let's say it like this,
Yes.
to see that people that are involved in the standard development, and there's a lot of, and I think you mentioned it as well, there's a lot of different stakeholders in these SE42 groups who are not always understanding, for example, the regulatory field that we're in as medical devices, and the harmonization between the standards is a bit difficult. And I think, and this is my main concern for Europe specifically, is that with the AI Act that's coming up, that there's enormous potential for government and especially the European Commission to start harmonizing all these SE42 standards under our AI Act, which is going to become messy because
yes,
in your example as well with the 23894, I think, for risk management for artificial intelligence, if that's going to be harmonized on the AI Act, and medical devices will be considered high risk devices under the AI Act, then which standard do we need to follow? Do we need to follow the 23984, or do we need to follow 14971? And obviously, we need to follow 14971. That's beyond any doubt. But do we need to follow a combination of the two? How is this going to work? And I fear this future, to be fair.
I totally agree. And that's getting in the way of us helping our patients. That's
Definitely.
the thing that, that's, yeah.
Yeah, I also fear that the need, and especially I think coming back to the question that was asked on startups as well, if you are a startup in the medical device field and you have an AI device, and you're just probably not even aware at the very beginning that regulatory is a big part of your organization, and then you will start having to have AI expertise and regulatory expertise, and the regulatory expertise is where you're going to find this, because it's hardly existing yet.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, we'll see. I think I don't see any other questions. If there's any questions, I would ask people to type them in the chat. But yeah, due to a small delay between our session and the live stream, I'm waiting for people to comment. Do you have any questions, Oliver?
Nope. Maybe more just like a comment. Like I really like your approach to regulation, Pat, because like I'm pretty new to the scene, even though I'm consulting for 2 years already. And I always had this impression that there weren't a whole lot of technical people actually writing these standards. And then we software developers always have this pain of implementing the standards, and it would be just super painful, especially what we discussed earlier this morning, like doing agile development while being 62304 compliant is kind of like this, I don't know, this thing nobody has really solved completely well yet. And I think I put a lot of hope into you, essentially implementing some sensible solutions there, because again, you have this technical background and you're not just a regulator.
And it's interesting you notice that, because I became interested in the standards and the regulations because I was trying to improve my product. This was about a decade ago, and the standards were very old, and the regulators never got to hospitals. They never got to see how our products are actually being used. So the regulators didn't understand the product either. And that was making me mad. The regulators and the standards were in the way of me making a better product for my patients. So that's why I got involved.
Yeah, and that's great.
Yeah. And it's definitely a concern, right? That standards are going to get in the way. And not even just standards, but just all regulations and all the sub-guidances and all the complexities in other countries. I think I can't see there's other questions right now. So I guess that it was quite clear. Your conversation was quite clear. I also think that a lot of people are probably a bit overwhelmed as well as to what's coming towards them. So I'm sure that people don't fully know yet what questions they should be asking. So I guess then it's a thanks to you, Pat, for being the last talk for the conference today. As I said, I think it's very informative and very helpful. Yeah, so thanks for your time and for the preparation work.